All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Design Basics, where you'll learn how to hack your graphic design skills. I'm Sophia,
I'm Evangeline.
and we're from Design at UCI.
So this presentation is a little bit geared more towards y'all who are beginners in design, whether you're participating in hackathon or not. We're just going to be going over some basic graphic design principles that would be really helpful and applicable for you no matter what field you decide to pursue.
Yep. So you might be asking yourself, hey, I'm not a designer, so why should I care? Well, design, contrary to popular belief, it's not just about choosing colors and being on Dribble and making things look pretty. So good design really helps your idea and content shine. So I know you guys are at HackUCI to create some really cool ideas and bring them to life. And if your design doesn't help people understand your idea, then it's doing disservice to you. So really, design helps make sure that your idea can be understood by everyone. So, and also if you process information visually, you are a designer, despite what you think. All right, so the first concept we're going to be talking about is hierarchy. And hierarchy is essentially, what's the most important thing on your page? So hierarchy, it is the principle of arranging elements to show the order of importance. So why do we care? So really good hierarchy means that the user can look through your content and know what's to read first and the next after that. So as you see from this graphic, obviously you're going to you will read this first, then you'll read this, then this one, and then you'll read that upper corner little text, you'll read this last. So there's a reason why you do this, and it's not as obvious as you think. So I know I gave just a text example, but hierarchy is not just text, it's also the elements of a page. So as you can see, like we don't have visual hierarchy. Everything is kind of hard to parse through. That's kind of like the bottom icon or bottom graphic. But if you have really strong visual hierarchy, I know what to look at first. All right, so I thought we'd work through an example together using type. So I pulled this from the hackathon website. This is just kind of the intro to the hackathon and trying to tell people what it's about. So as you can see, everything's the same width, everything's the same height, the size, and it's kind of hard to tell what goes with what just looking at this first example. And so the biggest thing that most people really do is, I'm pretty sure you guys already know this, is, hey, let's just make the headlines bigger. And that is something most people do. And this is kind of like a beginner first step towards hierarchy. So by just making the Welcome to HackUCI bigger and the What is a Hackathon bigger but still smaller, we know to read that first and read the next one second. But hey, that's kind of like a beginner tip. What about let's up the ante, right? So if you are doing hierarchy, another really great way to do it is contrast. So as you can see, I bolded Welcome to HackUCI, and I've also bolded the second headline. So there's more contrast between that headline and that body copy. So you're definitely going to read the Welcome to HackUCI first. And here's a little cool contrast pro tip. I know that you might think, hey, bringing contrast, I'll just bold things. But there's a limit to how much you can bold something. A really cool pro tip is that when you want to make something shine, you can also do that by making everything else fade. So as you can see on the left-hand example, the heading in black and the copy underneath are actually the same size. But the only difference is that I made the heading bolded, and I also made the body copy lighter at the same time. On the right, I only wanted that one word to stand out, so I bolded it and kept it black, but everything else I pushed back into the background. So that way there's more contrast and you can see that word stand out more. All right, so just this slide, I just did what I just talked about, that like little tip of bringing the secondary elements back. So I pushed all the body copy into a grayer font, and I kept the headlines black. So as you can see now, the contrast is even more distinct. And lastly, you can also play with color. So I made the Welcome to HackUCI a darker blue, and then the What is a Hackathon a lighter blue, just to show that, hey, this is more important. This is like also a secondary headline. So you can also play around with color to bring more contrast or to draw your eye to one element. And lastly, I know you might want to go back to the previous slide and just like switch back and forth to see the difference a little bit more. But what I did in this next one, so I did in the proximity slide, so you can stay on the proximity slide. So the next slide. Yeah, so what I did on this slide is essentially, in the previous slide, it was hard to tell if the second, So if you see in the bottom, that second paragraph, the distance between the what is a hackathon and that second paragraph is very, very wide. And the what is a hackathon subheadline is actually closer to the previous copy. So it's harder to make the distinction. These are two different groups, unless, and the second side for the, unless I move that second headline down. So the purpose of this is now you're starting to see different groups, right? So you clearly see a top group and you clearly see a bottom group. And so that bottom second half copy is going to be associated with that second subheadline because it's closer together. This is a law of proximity. It's a Gestalt principle. It's saying that if things are closer together, we're going to group them together visually. In the next slide. And so proximity is really just seeing groups and everything. You could technically like outline these in boxes if you want, but you don't always have to, because without those boxes, you can still clearly see their groups because they're closer together. Some elements are close together, making them one group, and then you see the other group. So group one and group two. And this is not just for text either. So if you look at this example, when you're making clear groups, the law of proximity can help you as well. So on the left, yeah, you have you're supposed to have like 9 different boxes, but because they're all equally spaced together, it kind of just reads as one giant group. Versus if you separate the elements and make sure the distance between the individual boxes is smaller than the larger than the elements within the box, you can clearly see 9 distinct groups. All right, so it's kind of like a meme format, but how it started and how it's going, we have completely transformed that previous copy, and now we can clearly see the visual hierarchy, and we know what to read first in this final rendition. And you might be asking yourself, like, hey, why does hierarchy matter? And why does visual hierarchy, what does it really do? Well, it's used everywhere. So if you look at any web page now, you'll start to see patterns. And this has been studied a lot, but the way people look at websites, there's actually 2 big patterns of like the way people scan pages. So if you're designing your landing page for your project, you might want to consider these. The first is called the F pattern, when you scan to the left and down the columns. So you kind of see that in this New York Times page. Your eye follows like an F pattern. The second pattern is a Z pattern. This is for like really big landing pages. So if you're thinking of a landing page, maybe keep these elements in mind. Your eyes basically scan like a Z pattern when you're scanning a page like this. Okay, so next I want to talk about readability, and readability is just making sure that your copy is easy to read. And so the first thing is line height. So line height is the vertical distance between different lines of text. And it's expressed either as a numeric value, so you have like 27-point line height, or as a percentage, like 125%. And so for line height, if you're ever confused, a really good rule of thumb to follow is to set the line height to 1.5 or 150% of the font size. So on the left, so in these examples, the font size is the same, so it's both 16. But on the left, I did a line height of just 0.65. And on the right, I did the 1.5 suggestion. As you can see, it's a lot harder to read when the line height is really cramped together. So make sure you try to space them out so it's a little easier to parse the text. Okay, the next is line length. So a good rule of thumb is to keep around 40 to 75 characters in line length. And you might be wondering, like, why does it really matter? Well, if you keep your line length too narrow, it actually hurts reading comprehension because your eyes are gonna be skipping around too much. But if you make it way too long, I don't know if you guys seen these websites where like the text it's across like the entire screen. You kind of like you lose focus of the actual sentence and you're trying reading like halfway through the text. So keeping it around 40 to 75 is a pretty good like rule of thumb to keep it moderate. Next, I want to talk about cleaner design. So cleaner design is just how do we make things look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing by taking out the unnecessary. So the first thing is that we see a lot for these kind of like elementary designs is outlines. So like we mentioned before, outlines are really helpful to like box off content. So I took those like grouped elements that we used before in the proximity example. As you can see on the left, I used like a black outline to like, hey, this is one group and here's another group. But the thing is, if you use the law of proximity, you don't actually need those outlines sometimes. You can use just the law itself to clearly delineate a group. So I removed the outlines, but you can still see that they're 2 different groups. But let's say you actually really want outlines, or you've already made outlines, you're like, I don't want to change this. Well, Consider also just having lighter outlines. So if you use a black outline, it really like the contrast is so harsh between the background of a white and like a black that you can try lightening it because it helps you bring those elements together, but it's a little less harsh on the eyes. Another really popular example or replacement for an outline that I'm sure you guys are all pretty familiar with is a shadow. So same point here, it's a lot less harsh on the eyes and it just makes the overall design seem a little more fresh, I guess. Ooh, and here's a really cool pro tip on shadows. Um, I think most shadows we see are always like gray in those like examples, but not all drop shadows have to be gray. So the way shadows work, actually, if you want to take your base color and just make your shadow color a delimitation of the base color, it actually makes for a more convincing shadow. So on the left, I use kind of like just a black with a light opacity, so it's like a gray shadow. But on the right, I took that purple color at a lower opacity, and it makes it seem a little bit more like a hovering effect and it's a little bit more believable. Next is white space. So white space is really just letting the design breathe. Um, I guess like the big takeaway here is that like empty space is a choice as well. So even though you have empty space, it doesn't mean that you're not making a design decision. As you can see, on the left, you have this like landing page site, right? But every element is like, it's like expanded across the entire site. And yes, it works, but compare that to the one on the right where you have a little more breathing space. Your eyes immediately focus on the text because it's right there, and it's because there's like a border around it, like you are kind of like tunnel visioned into the text.
Alrighty, moving on to branding and why everything Sophia just talked about is important. Branding is pretty much like the visual representation of your product. So no matter what you're creating, the branding is what truly makes your product yours and what makes it unique. And I'm going to be talking about topics like colors, typography, icons, and why those things are really important when you're designing whatever you're designing for your hackathon or any other project. So the first thing that we're going to be covering is color. Why is color important? Color is actually one of the most important elements in design. Color can definitely influence what your user feels and what they perceive about your brand, and it's a huge factor in brand recognition. So if I show you a color palette, you could instantly recognize that as, oh, let's say that's Twitter, or let's say that's Facebook. And that's really important when you're trying to build or create a brand. And color is obviously one of the first things that people notice. But we also want to stress that there are colorblind people out there. So when you're designing something, it's important to keep in mind contrast, because if you are colorblind and you have two different colors on a screen, but they're like relatively the same shade, a colorblind person might not be able to recognize what you're trying to convey to them. And so contrast is also super important. Definitely keep that in mind when you're selecting a color palette for your theme. The second thing that we want to stress is keeping a simple color palette. Keep everything simple. Don't pick like 10 different colors, because that's a little bit overwhelming for your user to see a large culmination of colors on the screen. So one thing that we recommend is the golden rule, which is the 60-30-10 rule that you also see in interior design, which is to have one primary color that's 60% of your design, and then two secondary colors that are 30% and 10% of your design. So that really keeps your design consistent, and also it gives it pop of color rather than just keeping everything grayscale. It still gives a lot of personality and branding. So color schemes aren't the only thing that keep your design consistent. It also, color is important to guide your user and influence your brand's personality. I'm going to be talking about that in the next couple slides. So there are three main types of color schemes that designers like to use in their designs. The first one being analogous color schemes. As you can see on the representation of the color wheel, analogous colors are just colors that are right next to each other on the color wheel. So for this example, we have like a magenta shade, a purple shade, and then like an indigo shade. And the second one is complementary colors. So if y'all ever did art in elementary school, or maybe if you're into makeup, you know that colors that are complementary balance each other out. So if you're trying to cancel out purple, you would use yellow because they're on opposite ends of the color wheel. So complementary colors are also really popular in design because they complement each other. The last color scheme is triadic. Triadic is where you plot 3 different points onto your color wheel, and therefore you create like a very, I guess, unique sort of color scheme. So in this example, I have green, orange, and purple. So I'm sure if y'all are participating in a hackathon, creating a color scheme or a color palette is probably the last thing on your mind. So we here have a resource for you. It's called coolers.co. It's a color palette creator, and basically it creates really aesthetic and really nice color palettes for you just with a click. And it's also really customizable, but you can also just simply click on your screen and it'll give you something instantly. So coolers can help you learn about complementary colors and what colors work well in designs. And they also have a resource, I believe, that shows you what color palettes are really popular right now. I know right now what's really popular in UX and UI is using a gradient of grayscale and then a pop of like purple. So on coolers, you can find a lot of the trends that are going on right now if you want to be like hip and trendy, you know. So colors are also really important when you're trying to interact with your user. So one thing we want to stress is to define your interactive color. So here you can see I have 3 buttons on this screen, and the background of this presentation is white. So we want to set the background to a certain color and then have denotative colors that portray an action. So if I want my user to communicate with a certain button, I wouldn't set that as like a shade of gray, because that sort of conveys to your user that, oh, I shouldn't be interacting with this button. So you would want to set your buttons that you want your user to interact with to a color that isn't necessarily part of your color scheme. So for example, if I want my user to press a cancel button and my color scheme is red, I wouldn't necessarily put my cancel button in red because it doesn't really denote an action for your user. And you want to stress usability. Wow, English, never heard of her. So the next thing I'm going to be talking about is denotative colors again, and why denotative colors are really important when you're creating like effective user interfaces. So I'm going to be going over that more in the next slide, and we're going to be having a quick quiz. Oh my God, it's not graded. So here on the screen, I have 2 options, option A and option B. Option A has delete account in a grayscale, and option B has delete account in red. So I'll give y'all a second to think which one is better. Play some elevator music. Do, do, do. So for this example, we would say option B is more effective in terms of design because the mockup in B has red as a color, which you don't see a lot in this mockup that I've created for y'all. So if your design, as I said before, was made up of all shades of red, I would consider option A as better because it sort of stands out, and denotative colors like stand out to your user and they're more likely to click it. So that's what you want when you're designing something, is you want your buttons and actionables to stand out to your user. So you also want to keep everything consistent. So if you're designing a screen and multiple screens have the action of delete account, you would keep the button the same color because you want learnability to be easier on your user. So the next slide is about typography and the different types of typefaces. So there's 2 different types of typefaces, the first one being a display typeface and the second being a text typeface. So as you can see on the screen, the first typeface I have is a display typeface. I believe this one is Pacifica. I could be wrong, but as you can see in the middle, it's really difficult to read. Like, honestly, it kind of makes me dizzy. So the reason you have different types of typefaces is because display typefaces are generally used for headers or larger text or anything that's a little bit easier to read. And they're not really suitable for large bodies of text simply just because they're not very easy to comprehend. Whereas with text typefaces, they're designed to be easily read. And there are certain types of typefaces that are definitely more easily readable than others. So definitely consider that when you're selecting text for your project. I definitely wasn't trying to say that you should use Papyrus for all your body text because readability and learnability for your user are super important aspects of design. The next aspect of consistency is buttons. So what are buttons? Buttons are anything on your screen that communicate any action to your user. So for example, if I have a button that says cancel, that would be something that communicates an action to my user and they would want to click that to cancel something. So the design of buttons is also something that can communicate hierarchy. As Sophia brought up in the previous slides, you want to create hierarchy with your buttons because some buttons are more important than others. For example, if you want a button going forward, you would create more hierarchy, maybe with a filled button instead of a line button, because that creates more intent of action for your user. Also, buttons can be clickable or non-clickable. Some buttons aren't meant to be interacted with. They're simply either there for future interaction or you just don't want them to interact with that shape. And here at the bottom, I have 3 different types of design for buttons. The first one being a filled button. As you can see, it's filled. And the second one being a line button. They each have their own purposes, and for whatever design purpose that you're serving, you can choose whatever button you like. The third one being rounded. Don't recommend rounded buttons for stacking because it tends to look like sausages, but it's up to you if you want to use it. I'm not here to judge you, but I would say with buttons, it's definitely a good idea to pick a shape that is, I guess, familiar to your user. I wouldn't put a button that says next and it's like a star because your user is not going to think to click on that because the buttons that we have here on the screen are generally what comes into your mind when you think of something that's actionable, like a continue screen or cancel or delete account screen. I wouldn't think to put like a heart or let's say a circle. That's generally not something that we interact with. So you want to consider that when you're designing buttons. Oop, another quiz. So here we have 2 more mockups, and we'll just give y'all a second to decide which one is better, A or B. So in this instance, we would say option A is better for multiple reasons, actually. So as you can see on option A, continue is in a filled button, but it's also in a denotative color, as we talked about previously. So it encourages interaction with your user. And also in option B, one negative is that actually I really can't read the continue. So that would sort of discourage your user from wanting to click it because they either might not see the option there at all, or they're just more likely to click cancel because it's in a denotative color that stands out to them as something that they haven't really seen before in your previous slides. Oop, another quiz. This one is buttons, but specifically labeling. So labeling, I would say, is arguably one of the most important aspects of buttons. Like, yes, the design of your button is important, but it's also important to label them properly and tell your user exactly what they're doing when they're pressing that button. So for this quiz, which one's better, A or B? The first one says, do you want to erase all files, yes or cancel? And option B says, do you want to erase all files, erase or cancel? So I'll give you all a second. So for this specific example, option B would be the better or more effective design because the button erase tells you exactly what you're doing, tells your user when they click this button, they're going to be erasing all files. However, design A says yes, but what does yes mean? I don't know what yes means. Yes, I want to erase all files, but if they don't go back and connect those two, if I take out erase all files as a question, I have no idea what yes and cancel mean. So you want to keep that in mind. Technically, option A could work, but in a lot of cases, it's better to have a button where if you look at it alone without the question, will still make some sort of sense to your user. Alrighty, moving on to icons. So what are icons? Icons should be ambiguous designs that communicate some sort of meaning in your project. And effective icons should be understood without text. So if I show you a printer icon, you'll know what that means before I even put a caption underneath it. And that's what sort of denotates an effective icon. So when you're using icons in your design, definitely think about using familiar icons, such as the print, or I guess Google has some familiar icons, but I wouldn't use things like a pumpkin on top of Patrick Star to denote like printing, because no one's going to know what you mean until you tell them underneath that icon what you mean. Another important aspect of icons is it scalable? Because even if your icon makes sense at 100% size, if you shrink it down to 15% and your user has no idea what it looks like, or it's just a blob on your screen, then it probably isn't the most effective icon for your design. And you also want to keep it consistent. You might think, why? Well, as long as my icon it makes sense, why do I have to keep my design consistent? Well, here's some examples. So as you can see on the first slide, it doesn't flow. The star doesn't have any correlation, and it just doesn't communicate effectively and communicate effective learnability to your user, because this is sort of a no-brainer, but ambiguous icons don't make sense. So you want unambiguous icons to be a consistent theme in your design. And if you're going to stick to a theme, stick to it. I'm assuming none of y'all have the time to be creating your own icons. And there are just so many resources out there where you can find effective and consistent and harmonious icons that if you have the time and resource to view the next couple of slides, you'll find all of those free resources that we linked to you. So when you're designing icons, definitely think about, first of all, the design of the icon itself. So if you're going to have all filled icons or all lined icons, stick to that. And if you're going to have icons that are ambiguous, such as this one on the left corner that says text editing, I have no idea what that icon means. It could mean kerning, it could mean anything, line spacing, but if you don't put text next to that icon, it doesn't really have a specific or set meaning, unlike these icons at the top left, like printer. I know exactly what that means. Go home, I know to go to the home screen. So definitely keep that in mind when you're implementing icons into your design, because it honestly is a really important part. So here's that resource we were talking about. This is icons8.com, and they have a ton of free resources for y'all. So all you need to do is just go on their website and you can download icon packs. I'm sure in like such a high intense environment, such as a hackathon, you don't have time to be like pulling up a grid and designing your own icon and make sure it's like a vector and like make sure it's scalable. But definitely make sure you're using I guess credible resource such as icons8, and not just going on Google and Googling some super pixelated PNG that you find of the Instagram icon. So definitely recommend finding your appropriate resources when you're designing for anything. Ooh, illustrations, more free resources. When does it end? Where can we get more free resources? So here we're going to be posting our slide deck. So if y'all want to actually click on our embedded links, there are a ton of resources with implementing illustrations into your design. We would like to preface and give y'all a disclaimer that using illustrations such as these that you see on the left should be used sparingly and when appropriate, because honestly, in design today, we see a lot of illustrations that are placed inappropriately, where they're just randomly with no correlation to the design, just in the top left corner. And it sort of confuses your user because they're sort of not sure why that graphic is supposed to be there, and it doesn't communicate an effective message to them. So it doesn't really do you any good. So anytime you're placing any sort of image or icon onto your design, make sure it serves a purpose, because graphic design or UI or UX design is not art. It's not something that is just simply aesthetic to be aesthetic. Your design has to serve a purpose. And if it's not making your product better, and even though it's making it look better, it's making it harder for your user to communicate with you and for you to communicate with your user, then it's not effective design. So thank y'all for listening to our presentation. So you can find us at design@uci.com, and you can join our club for newsletters. And please attend our weekly workshops, which me and Sophia will be hosting, so you can see our lovely faces again. But we're really glad that y'all are participating in a hackathon and trying to learn a little bit more about design, because honestly, there isn't enough designer representation in the hackathon, or I guess developer world. So we think it's really admirable that y'all are trying to learn more about that.
Yeah, and also our club is open to people of all majors. So if you feel like, oh, I don't want to be the only CS person there, you're not going to be. We have a lot of CS people, or any major. And yeah, we host workshops, so make sure you come. And thank you so much for attending.
We'll see